Final Fantasy VII released in 1997, and in my childhood, I didn't play it. I was 3. But when I was 9 years old, I didn't play it. I was too busy playing Kingdom Hearts.
This is it!
But when I was a teenager, I did play it. The Final Fantasy brand has shifted over the years, whether that be the look, or the gameplay, or the storytelling. There's an evolving nature to the Final Fantasy formula where it feels as if you won't ever see the same game twice. If there is one title in this series that it feels like most fans have deemed the best formula, it's Final Fantasy VII. And in the dumpster fire that is 2020, we got a remake. So after playing part 1 of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, I want to tell you what I've learned about this title and why I think this flawed, confused, but beautiful game might have actually ignited my passion for a series that is decades old. The striking element to this game, right before you even press new game, is the music. Good God, the music. Music taste is subjective, but I think that there are some objective elements that we can look at here. One being whether the music fits the scene. And while most games have the music fit the feeling of an area, exceptional games have the music fit the underlying story beats as well. This game's music manages to do both, and even manages to change the original in ways that fit this remake specifically, in a way in which they wouldn't have fit the original. It's really impressive, and it's clear that everyone brought their A game here. Here are some of my favorite tracks that I feel really showcase the impressive music on display. Then there's the graphics. There's a level of detail here that rivals anything seen in a video game. The essence of a grimy metallic city is perfectly encompassed within the visuals. However, this doesn't prove to be true on all accounts. I think the perfect word for this game's graphics is jarring. This game can look breathtaking, but when it looks bad, it looks, For some reason, some of the textures can look absolutely awful, and the NPCs often look like Play-Doh. They almost look like a different species compared to the main cast, who all have an astounding level of polish. A part of me almost wants to say that I wish this main cast looked a little worse, just so that the NPCs wouldn't look so distractingly bad at times. At times, it feels like you can see the wiring under the skin as they move and speak, just to throw you off guard. Another distracting component of this game's presentation is the frequent amount of pop-ins in busy areas. I didn't play this on the PS4 Pro because I'm not monetized yet. But even without that, I don't think this should be happening. There's also some odd static background images that range from looking great to fine to I first noticed this in chapter 6, and I thought it looked bad because they were cutting a few corners, and that does happen from time to time, so I really couldn't blame them. But then I got to chapter 15. Good God.
Is this an accident?
The whole level views this scene, and even the characters make a note to address it. I really don't know how they could possibly have thought this looked good, so I think the team should be commended for a majority of how this game looks. There's some glaring issues that make the graphics as a whole feel that they have some obviously rushed elements. The menu and UI design, though, doesn't seem to have as many hiccups. It's sleek and easy to use, with obvious information being easy to read. The only exception to the easy functionality of the menus would be the weapon grids, which often feel clunky to navigate with odd pathways through the spheres themselves. This is definitely a case where they prioritized how the menus looked and not how they felt to use. It's also odd that the weapon grids show you the stats attached to each weapon, but not the abilities within them. If I want to know which weapon has the attack up at high HP ability, I've got to go into the weapon and then go to the spear to see if the weapon has that skill. This would be a relatively easy fix in future titles, but I can see this compounding based on how many new weapons that they add in the next game, so I think this really needs to be fixed. But overall, I find the presentation to be pleasant, with some odd inclusions. A component of this game that I found to also be mostly excellent is the The combat is an achievement, and maybe the best part of this title. The hybrid system they're going for here really has a great functionality and flow. I really love how everything looks. The moves hold weight and all achieve a different purpose for different occasions. There's a very little overlap with move usage, meaning that if a character has a move that does significant damage during a stagger, there isn't a move that achieves that same purpose for the same character. This makes finding different weapons and learning new moves feel purposeful, and I really appreciate that. The combat's presentation is also relatively well done, since each move looks distinct. However, it can also look a bit hectic at times, with particles gushing all over the place. The camera can often get stuck behind walls and objects too, which further adds visual noise that distracts from the combat. A lot of the camera problems have to do with the design of many of these dungeons, which are often narrow and confined. The camera is super close on the player for this reason, but while this may fix potential issues during exploration, it compounds on these issues for combat. This is because unlike exploration, in combat your character can flip all over the place and fly around the arena with their flashy moves. Because of this, your camera can start to really freak out, and if you get too close to objects or the wall, you can often get stuck. It makes the combat feel as if it should have moved the player to a separate field like in other game series, or even like the Colosseum battles or battles with summons. Those feel like some of the best battles in the game because you're not also fighting the camera along with the enemy. The battle system itself, however, is a well-crafted system. There's a certain sense of fluidity which connects everything in the combat, and that type of combat feels the most at home in this hybrid system. Certain attacks can be strung together without delay or lag between them, such as Cloud's focus thrust with Braver. I just wish the game told you which moves could be strung together fluidly, but honestly that's just a nitpick with me, and doesn't change that it's fun and exciting to chain attacks together. Really though, my main issue with the combat in this game is how enemies target the player. I hate the aggro system in this game, or well, the lack of one. Whenever you're switching characters, it seems that the enemy immediately pulls to that character. It really destroys immersion for me, as it makes it feel like the game knows who you're controlling, and that the enemy doesn't target who's actually attacking them instead. Not only does this take me out of the game, it also results in pretty shitty experiences when you're trying to play as a ranged character.
Well, that really sucked.
There's one materia in the game that pulls aggro, but it only works at low HP and it doesn't work on bosses. This results in playing as Aerith and Barret becoming pretty frustrating in boss encounters. Aerith is especially frustrating since she can't be changed to a melee attacker like Barret can with certain weapons. This means if you want to optimally use Aerith without getting spammed or killed in a few hits, you need to switch out of her after every few normal attacks as to not get targeted by the enemy. In hard mode, this resulted in really annoying situations, which is a shame considering she's one of the most fun characters to play as in the game. I also have mixed opinions about your party's AI in general. It seems the game tries to encourage switching characters as much as possible due to the lack of general party instructions that would be found in most games like this. I don't think the lack of those party instructions is an oversight though, as this series in the past has done those. Instead, I think this was purposeful, as to make the game lean more towards the strategic and less towards action combat, as to create that hybrid feeling that they were going for, which honestly, encouraging switching characters and giving orders in the moment isn't a bad idea. But that doesn't give them license to have your party members stand there in combat and not fight at all. I wish the AI was a bit more aggressive, or at the very least, was conscious of their placement near an enemy. So my issue isn't in the lack of AI tactics, but rather it's in the lack of the AI positioning and attacking in a manner suited to their individual characters. It's an odd misstep in an overly well-made combat system. All of these missteps are exacerbated though on hard mode, because enemies hit harder and you can't use items, so one party member putting themselves in the wrong location can result in a game over pretty quickly, making you redo an already long boss fight all over again. Speaking of the bosses, I really do love them here. Final Fantasy has fallen into holes in the past when it comes to boss encounters, making them all require relatively similar tactics without taking advantage of the combat systems that they created. Here though, the bosses all have different gimmicks to them that allows for quick thinking and diverse material usage. It's a rather intelligent design, and there aren't very many missteps here. I will say, however, that in order to get the most out of these bosses, materia like assess and parry are almost always needed. The materia system is a good one, and I enjoy the amount of diversity it can add to combat by giving you many different options, but the system can lead to bosses being much longer because a certain materia isn't equipped. Take for instance, fighting a boss weak to fire, yet not having the fire materia equipped. Essentially, if you want to battle the boss with fire, you'll need to leave the battle, then come back again. I'm not entirely sure how this could be fixed. It's only a small annoyance, but I thought it should be noted. The lengthening of boss fights like this also helps to elongate the title as a whole, which, not for the sake of bragging, can be irregularly girthy. The game is not paced well. There are a lot of chapters that feel really long and or really unimportant. Take the train graveyard, for example. There are really great character moments with certain characters here, but besides that, there really isn't much else. And that's just the thing. The main plot in a lot of these chapters is incredibly thin. What keeps things interesting are these fantastic characters. It made me wish that there was something more interesting going on for these characters to react to. Let's also talk about chapter 14. Keep in mind, this is the last chapter in the game before you're committed to the end of the game without the ability of side quests or backtracking, so they decide to focus on the most important character in the game. Now, I will acknowledge that he may reappear in a future title, probably actually, but you're really telling me that we should be focusing on him and treading through the sewers again right when we're about to enter the final area? It doesn't mean this character isn't interesting to a degree, it just means that this chapter is so oddly placed in the overall story. Let's also talk about the next chapter, chapter 15. I think this chapter encompasses everything wrong with the pacing of this game. This chapter isn't needed. It seems they put it in there because it's a cool concept. Having to travel up to Shinra headquarters is really neat, but that doesn't translate to it being anything meaningful. Story-wise, the chapter is devoid of anything of importance, like a lot of other chapters in this game, but it also doesn't have character moments either.
This keeps up, I'm gonna get bored.
At least chapter 11 and the end of chapter 14 have something to say about certain characters, but here there's nothing of value, and this makes this chapter especially bad because of that offensive background image.
Nice.
Speaking of little to no value, let's talk about the side quests. They're boring. A lot of reviewers mention the finding the cats quest or killing the rats quest, and you know what? Those are bad, but I will give them a pass. They're the first side quests in the game, and it makes sense to start small. What I won't give a pass are the quests to find the f***ing dumbass kids or kill the robots. The only side quests that are worth anything are the ones that include minigames or the ones that switch up the formula a little bit. Most of the side quests, though, just don't expand the world or these characters in any real meaningful way. A lot of them are just fetch quests or monster killing quests that don't have an interesting story. They should have just added them to a quest menu like with Chadley's requests that you can complete throughout the game at your own pace, which Chadley's quests, I'll say, are more enjoyable. They cause you to see combat a little differently and incentivize you to try out new combat tactics. Doing this to the actual side quests would have made them feel more meaningful, as it wouldn't have you slog through pointless dialogue about uninteresting characters. Ultimately, while these side quests have boring objectives, it's ultimately the poor storytelling that makes them pointless. But again, these are optional, and since it doesn't appear the developers spent much time on them, you really shouldn't have to either. The pacing, dungeon construction, and amount of dialogue in this game tells the player that the story is essentially the most important aspect of this title. So to discuss it, I want to divide the story analysis into multiple parts. There are the characters, the plot, and the ending, and I feel very different about all of these aspects. Let's look at the cast that we have here. There are 4 central, playable protagonists in this game: Cloud, Barrett, Tifa, and Aerith. They are, by far, the shining light to this game's story. They all serve a distinct role and have enough conflict with one another to make the events interesting. Most of the conflict centers around our protagonist, Cloud. While Cloud's past remains relatively secret up to the end of the game, his personality isn't. The game does well in portraying Cloud as a selfish individual, out for a quick buck, and the title ultimately seeks to show his development from this angsty, antisocial Karen
What I'd like you to do is apologize instead of being a bitch.
to a caring, driven, and active character. The rest of the cast acts as devices to develop him further. Tifa is a symbol of his past and who he was and how he's changed to his current cold self. Barrett acts as a personality foil, whereas Cloud is aloof and uninterested. Barrett is passionate and motivated with distinct values. He's also,
Oh my god.
He also acts as a motivating factor to make Cloud care about a cause again. Finally, we have Aerith, who acts as a form of strength that Cloud is lacking. Strength of trust, love, and vulnerability. But she also has aspects of Cloud himself, such as her mysterious nature and dishonesty, causing Cloud to be especially susceptible to being drawn to her and being changed by her. I don't think this should be ignored. This game is a character study through and through. Well, most of it.
7 seconds till the end.
And I think it really does a good job at being that, which matters because this game also has a relatively thin plot. I can see people saying that this game doesn't really have a plot because it kind of goes nowhere, and you know what? I kind of agree with that. But I also think that that's completely wrong. A plot is nothing if not for the sake of its characters. The plot can be masterful, but if it doesn't serve its characters, then to me, it's not worth telling. So I will say this, I love these characters here, and I really do think that they're worth exploring. Even the side characters such as Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, who get a lot of screen time here. But the plot could definitely be more concise and eventful as to place place the characters in situations that develop and test them even more. Antagonists should essentially serve to place the protagonists in situations that do test them. So how are the antagonists here? Well, they're not the best. The Shinra Corporation acts as the big bad, and Avalanche acts as the heroes. I've seen a lot of reviewers say that the beginning explosion of the Sector 7 Mako reactor is poignant because the characters have to look at what they've done. And while that may be true from the perspective of the characters themselves, it isn't true from our perspective. We see that Shinra goes out of its way to destroy the reactor and cause the explosion itself, essentially denying Avalanche a victimless win. It's a different angle, certainly different than the original game where the party does cause the death of countless innocents, but in this title they clearly chose to make Avalanche the almost unequivocal good guy. So I find it odd that so many reviewers have tried to take the stance that this game makes you think about the character's actions with regards to setting the bomb. The story could have chosen that angle, but it didn't. There's little black and white about who is evil here, even if the game does show some complexity with regards to those who work for Shinra, showing that just because a corporation is bad doesn't mean that those who work for it are. The main baddies on display here are certainly all one note. Sephiroth especially.
7
Which we'll get into that later. They all have an evil gimmick and are mustache twirlers. The Turks get a little in terms of fleshing out their characters, but everyone else are seemingly evil for the sake of being evil. I'm fine with antagonists that you'd love to hate, that aren't complex and understandable. That certainly works for this story at times, but there are 6 non-complex villains here, and they all feel like evil robots. There are way too many antagonists here, and most feel unrealistically evil. Sephiroth showing up initially didn't seem like a bad idea to me. Having this series be in multiple parts means it's a smart idea to introduce the possible central antagonist in the first part, even if it was just for a few appearances or mentions. Here, though, they seem obsessed with showing off Sephiroth. But let's ask ourselves, who is Sephiroth? Not who is Sephiroth in the original, but who is Sephiroth here? If you're someone who's playing this game without playing the original, you won't know much. You'll come to know that he was a renowned soldier who might have done something to Cloud, and that Cloud maybe killed him, but that's it. That's all we know. But what about from Sephiroth himself? Well, this is ultimately where I have a huge problem. Sephiroth doesn't speak like everyone else, or even a normal person. Instead, he speaks in Nomura speak. Nomura speak is another way of saying that a character speaks in philosophical gibberish that neither explains anything or characterizes the character at all.
Those who look with clouded eyes see nothing but shadows. Careful now. That which lies ahead does not yet exist. 7 seconds till the end.
And that is all Sephiroth is here. He's a mouthpiece that essentially alludes to a bunch of nonsense that may or may not be explained in future installments, but he's not a character. If my problem with the other antagonists in the game is that they seem too unrealistic, that they lean into the absurd in a way that makes them feel unreal in an otherwise real world, Sephiroth makes me feel nothing. What is his personality? Why is he doing what he's doing? What is his dialogue really saying? I can understand mystery, especially in a multi-part series, but managing to not characterize such a central character is a huge blunder, especially considering the...
Bring it on, bitch.
The ending feels like a car crash. I think the best word I can find for this ending is disjointed. Essentially, this ending involves the Whispers, who are physical manifestations of destiny created by the planet to maintain the flow of time. The characters choose to defy them, destroy them, and thus create an undetermined future that they can now change without the influence of destiny. This theme of destiny sounds like something I should have discussed already in the plot portion of this review, but throughout the game, the Whispers are relatively side aspects to the plot. They show up every now and then, and the characters seem bewildered by their motives and appearances, but that's kinda it. It's later explained that they were actually just keeping the plot the same as the original game, and this is where I start to have a problem. The problem I have with the ending isn't the concept. I think that the concept is pretty cool and interesting. It's the execution of that concept and its placement in this particular title that I have a problem with. The game turns from a character-centered narrative to a plot-centered one in the last hour. Here's what I mean. The plot for the whole game is rather slim. It's fairly simple. The depth is in the characters and how these characters change and react to their world. Again, this game up until the end is a character study through and through, and at the end, that's mostly all taken away. There's some fun moments in the last hour, but mostly it's all plot. You're not really sure what this all means for the main cast. It's a massive focus shift. So while the Whispers and their plot may have been alluded to throughout the whole title, it doesn't change that this title wasn't about them, and that the focus wasn't on them. So this focus shift in the last hour feels disjointed and unnatural. The party are moved into this new dimension like puppets to defy fate for the story and not for any solid, well-developed character motivations. The themes of this game would have you think that this game was actually about destiny and how these characters are shackled by it. But again, this element of destiny isn't introduced until the final hours, making it relatively unconnected to the rest of the plot. And while the Whispers make appearances throughout the title, foreshadowing is not development. The Whisperers being in this game does not mean this game is about destiny. The actual portrayal of the events in the ending itself is just noise. The game goes from 0 to 5 million in the span of 5 minutes. It's whiplash inducing. You have a group of characters that go from having trouble with robots and saving Aerith from an evil corporation to entering a fucking portal to a different dimension, fighting and defeating a little manifestation of destiny, and then fighting a seemingly omniscient and meteor-infused Sephiroth at the edge of creation.
What I'd like you to do is apologize instead of being a bitch.
It's explosions and debris and Cloud calling Destiny a bitch and Aerith talking shit to Sephiroth and wow, 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 wow. If there's such a thing as jumping the shark in video games, this thing jumped so far above the shark that it's now at the edge of creation. It looks cool, but it doesn't mean anything to this story and to these characters. So then, what's happening here under the surface? Well, this ending is seemingly a meta-commentary over the whole idea of a remake in general, and essentially it's a statement about how future installments won't follow the trajectory of the original game. The odd aspect of this is that while trying to give themselves a narrative reason to change up the story of the original, they've now shackled themselves to it even more. I don't think this should be understated. This ending is a sequel to Final Fantasy VII and its companion series. You need prior knowledge of the history of this series, such as the original and even Crisis Core, to receive any benefit from the story beats occurring here at the end. Zack living, the Sephiroth fights with one-winged angel playing at the end, defying fate, allusions to Aerith's death. All of this means nothing in this game's story. The game and the writers have made it clear. This ending is for those who know this universe. And with Zack alive, they've now alluded that this series is for those who know of this universe. But as a result of this, they've forgotten about the characters in this game, the characters that this story has been about since the beginning. The game also just kind of moves on from this ending as well. After fighting Shinra and Destiny and Sephiroth, our characters kind of just walk away, seemingly unfazed, like the mannequins that this last act has made them. I think meta commentary can be powerful, but I also think that it needs to fit. It needs to be placed in such a way that it doesn't deter from the already established narrative, and it needs to serve the story at large. And I don't mean established narratives such as the original Final Fantasy VII, I mean just this game. It needs to fit, and here it doesn't. It's rather ironic, as the character's decision to combat Destiny doesn't feel like it's actually their choice. By attempting to give this story agency to move in new directions, it took all agency away from the characters at the center of it. Final Fantasy VII Remake is remarkably confusing. It hits so many high notes with its characters, its combat, and its world, but it can also feel hollow, feel like the world and its characters are in a disjointed narrative. This game feels like something I haven't experienced from Square Enix in years though. It can feel refreshing, like something a team wanted to make and a story that writers wanted to tell. In truth, I hope that's the DNA that gets transferred into future titles. The painstaking detail to emotion, character, and world building, rather than the breakneck ending's love for shock, awe, junk food excitement, and convoluted story beats like multiverses and maybe even time travel. Even with this game's flaws, I still want to revisit this world and these characters for another strange journey. Here's to hoping that this game's destiny can be changed and that we can get a series and characters that truly stand the test of time.